time we had a lesson here, or last time that I taught here, 2 weeks ago, I had started answering some questions that I had received in our question box, and the first question that I'm starting to deal with is this issue of Christians and alcohol, or as it was essentially asked to me, Jesus drank wine, are we allowed to drink wine? And so that's what we started with. You know, the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 14:33, God is not the author of confusion. Everybody knows that verse. You've heard that before. But you look at Proverbs 20, verse 1, and the Bible says, wine is a mocker. Strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. But you look at Genesis chapter 27, verse 28, we see the patriarch Isaac is bestowing God's blessing on his son Jacob, and he says, therefore God, give thee of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine. So, wine is clearly being cursed in Proverbs chapter 20, and being called a mocker, and yet Isaac is using it as a source of blessing to his son Jacob. How can that be? So that's part of the question that we're looking at here. How is it, or why is it that wine in some places in the Bible is looked upon and spoken of as a blessing, and yet in other places in the Bible it's clearly cursed, and people are warned about the dangers of it? And there are good answers for that. So we started by looking at the culture from which the Gentile saints of the first century were born into and then saved out of, where drunkenness was not some kind of public sin or something like that. Drunkenness had been elevated to a position of worship, that it came out of a pagan religion of that time that taught that drunkenness was a way to commune with the gods. But Paul had clearly taught the Ephesians in Ephesians 5:18. He said, and be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. So Paul is making it plain to believers that loss of control is not a path to worship and must be avoided. And so I mentioned last time that if you're looking for a verse in the Bible that simply forbids the drinking of wine, you're not going to find it, other than the instructions concerning the vow of a Nazarite in Numbers chapter 6, in which the Nazarites were told that they could have nothing from the vine, not wine, not raisins, not even grapes, nothing from the vine. But the vow of the Nazarite was meant as a temporary vow until some kind of promised action was completed. And part of the vow of the Nazarite is they couldn't cut their hair, and the reason for that is because to have long hair was a shame to men, still is, still should be. And so it was an incentive to get whatever vow, whatever promise you had made accomplished, so that you could cut your hair. So during that Nazarite vow, nothing from the vine was to be used. But that's the only place in the Bible where you find a straight out, unequivocal, can't touch it. But there is critical information regarding this issue that we're looking at right now in the form of 8 questions, what I've heard called the Christian's wine list. And we started considering the first question last time. And that question is drinking wine today the same as it was in Bible times? And the reason that that question is so important is because the argument made by people, by Christians who want to be able to drink wine, they always say, well, Jesus drank wine, and the apostles drank wine, and they drank wine in the Old Testament, they drank wine in the New Testament, so isn't it okay for us to drink wine? And so if you're going to use that argument, then you have to ask this question. Is it the same? Was drinking wine in Bible times the same thing that people are drinking today? And even more specifically, is the wine that they were drinking in Bible times the same as wine today? And the short answer is not even close. Not even close to being the same. And that's what we've been looking at. And looking at the words that are translated as wine in our King James Bible. And in doing that, it is critical that you understand what that substance was that is called wine in the Bible. How was it made? What substance were they talking about? Now, in our culture, in modern times, wine is made by fermenting grapes for the specific purpose of creating alcohol. So, my last name is Vallone. From the time I was in 5th grade, my full-blooded Italian grandfather and my full-blooded Italian grandmother lived with us. And I remember my grandfather making wine in the basement of our house. 20 pounds of grapes and 10 pounds of sugar and water and mixing it all up and letting it sit for a couple of weeks. So, it went on in my own household. So wine was an important part of the Italian culture. But is that the same as what was happening in Bible times? Well, no, it definitely was not, because wine is made today by fermenting grapes for the specific purpose of creating alcohol. But in Bible times, what they called wine was made by taking grape juice and boiling it down to being a paste or a thick syrup. And they did that so it could be stored. They called that wine, boiled down to prevent it from fermenting. Whereas now they do it to create alcohol. Back then, they boiled it to keep it from fermenting. And this boiled down syrup or paste would be stored that way. And then when they wanted to drink wine, they would take some of that syrup or paste and they would mix it with water before they would drink it. The most common word translated as wine in the New Testament is the Greek word oinos, O-I-N-O-S. And it's a word that simply means the juice of grapes. In fact, anywhere in the New Testament that you find the word wine by itself, it is always, the Greek word is always oinos. The one place in Acts where it talks about new wine, that's a different word and a different substance. Everywhere else in the New Testament you find the word wine, the Greek word is oinos. And in the Old Testament, they had an Old Testament word for the same substance, and that word is yayin, Y-A-Y-I-N. That's the Hebrew word. And that word specifically refers to wine that is mixed, because they would mix it with water before they drank it. Sometimes they put in additional ingredients, honey or herbs or things like that, but always mixed with water. So oinos and yayin, they meant wine mixed with water. And the point is, and it's an important one here, is that wine was always diluted before it was drunk. In fact, if it was not diluted, it was not called wine. In our King James Bible, anywhere that it's talking about a substance made from grapes that has not been diluted, it's called strong and fermented. It's called strong drink. It's never translated as the word wine. So wine was always diluted, anywhere from 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine, all the way up to 20 parts water or more to 1 part wine. We also looked at the words that are translated as strong drink. In the Old Testament, the word is shakar. And in the New Testament, the Greek word for the same substance was sakara, or is sakara. Both these words are never translated as the word wine anywhere in our Bible. They are only translated as strong drink, and the words, both the Hebrew word and the Greek word, those words actually mean unmixed or undiluted. So it's referring to wine that's been fermented and undiluted. So that boiled down paste, or that syrup, it could be mixed with water, and if they left it to ferment, it could ferment, but it would typically be a very low fermentation. So the word wine in our King James Bible does not necessarily mean an intoxicating beverage, and more often than not, it was not an intoxicating beverage. So the substance called wine in our Bible is typically not fermented or had only a tiny amount of alcohol. So based on these terms, the wine of Bible times was not at all the same as the wine that we have today. The wine people drink today is not diluted with water. It's straight undiluted wine, never called wine in our Bible. It would only be called strong drink in our Bible. when they wanted to drink it, the onyos, or the yayin, they would always dilute it with water. According to Pliny, the Roman historian, with all the way up to 20 parts water or more. So it was extremely diluted. And that's understandable. If it had been boiled down to a syrup or a paste, they had to mix it in order to be able to drink it. And this was the preferred drink of the ancient Mediterranean world. That's why Professor Samuel Lee, that I quoted 2 weeks ago, he said that this was the most common way of storing and preparing wine. And even though it was possible that once this wine syrup or wine paste would be mixed with water, it could be left to ferment again, the amount of alcohol was really small and much lower than the alcohol content of wine today. In fact, I found information from a Dr. Newman, a professor of chemistry in Berlin back in the 18th century, who said, "It is observable that when sweet wines are boiled to a thick consistency, they not only do not ferment in that state, but are not easily brought into fermentation even when diluted with water." So even diluting them back then and leaving them stand, they might ferment, but they would ferment really slowly. And this minuscule alcohol content was the reason that the Bible warns against spending extended amounts of time with wine. Proverbs 23, verses 29 and 30 says, "Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes?" Verse 30, "They that tarry long at the wine." They that go to seek mixed wine. Because it took a lot of time to be able to get drunk drinking that stuff, because the alcohol content was so low. And in 1 Timothy 3:3 and in Titus 1:7, both of those places impose a restriction on Christian leaders that they be, in the phrase in our Bible is "not given to wine." And interestingly, that phrase, "not given to wine," is translated from a single Greek word. The word is paraonios, and it literally means to be around the wine, to hang out with the wine, because it took a lot of time to get drunk drinking that stuff, because the alcohol content was, if it was there at all, was so small. That's certainly not the case in modern times. It's considered now that the average person would become intoxicated with just 3 drinks. That would be 3 beers, or 3 glasses of wine, or 3 shots of some kind of hard liquor. And if you're thinking, well, fine, I'll just stop after 2, well, hold on, because there's still more to consider than that. So let me share with you some quotes from classical writers of the ancient world that talked about the fact that wine was most of the time not intoxicating, what our Bible calls wine. Horace was a well-known poet of the Roman world during the time of Augustus Caesar, and he wrote back in 35 BC, he said, quote, "You can quaff under a shade cups of unintoxicating wine." Now, quaff means to drink, and under a shade was, like a shade tree or something. "You can drink under a shade tree cups of unintoxicating wine." Plutarch was a Greek philosopher and a historian, and in AD 60, he wrote this: "Filtered wine neither inflames the brain nor infects the mind and the passions, and is much more pleasant to drink." So Plutarch is saying, I like the kind of wine that has no alcohol content. It doesn't inflame the mind or anything, and it's much more pleasant to drink. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, everybody's heard of him. He said, "The wine of Arcadia was so thick it was necessary to scrape it from the skin bottle in which it was stored and dissolve the scrapings in water." Virgil was a contemporary of Horace. Back in 30 BC, he talked about the kind of wine that's boiled down to, quote, "the luscious juice and then preserved." And Homer, you've probably heard of him. You ever read his book, The Odyssey? I had to read it in high school. In the 9th book of the Odyssey, he tells us that Ulysses took in his boat a goat skin of sweet black wine, and when it was drunk, it was diluted with 20 parts of water. Which again is understandable, because it was boiled down to a paste or a syrup, so it had to be excessively diluted in order to drink it. Columella was a Roman writer of the 1st century, around the same time as the Apostles, and he wrote that in Italy and Greece it was common to boil the wines, which of course would not have been done if they were trying to preserve any alcohol content. And then moving forward in time, Archbishop Potter, who was born in 1672, wrote a series of volumes called Grecian Antiquities. And in volume 2, page 360, he says, the Laodiceans used to boil their wines over the fire and then later drink them. And he also referred to Democritus, a philosopher who died all the way back in 300 BC, and to Palladius, a Greek physician who also made similar statements. So all these ancient authorities called this boiled down syrup, this paste, they called it wine. And like I said before, Pliny the Elder talked about diluting it, and he said that this stuff has the consistency of honey. And it wasn't just a Roman practice, the Jews did it too. The Mishnah, which is the codification of the Jewish law, states that the Jews were in the habit of using boiled wine. There was a guy back in the 18th century, W.G. Brown. He traveled all over Asia and Europe and Africa, and he states that the wines of Syria were mostly prepared by boiling immediately after they were expressed from the grape until they were considerably reduced in quantity and then put into jars or bottles and preserved for use. So, the historical fact is that what was called wine in the Bible was typically a non-intoxicating beverage. A non-intoxicating beverage. By the way, that stuff, that substance, that concentrated grape juice syrup paste stuff, is still around today. Mm-hmm. It's called dibs, D-I-B-S. That's the Arabic word. In Greek, it's called petimisi. In Italian, it's vino cotto. And in Turkish, it's pekmez. And if you want to see some or try some for yourself, guess what? You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy everything on Amazon. Yeah, I found it on Amazon, an 8.4 ounce jar for 27 bucks. And it's used a lot today in the vineyards of Palestine and Jordan and Lebanon. It's used as a food seasoning. It's even put on bread like jam or jelly that we would use today. And it saves the necessity of refrigeration to preserve a non-fermenting drink. So the point of all this is simply to say you can't call the wine that people drink today anything close to the wine that the Bible talks about. This concentrated grape juice. So you got to give up that argument. You can't say, well, Jesus drank wine and the apostles drank wine, so it must be okay for us. It's not the same stuff. History has something else to tell us on this subject. That drinking unmixed wine was looked upon, even by unsaved people, as barbaric. Athanasius quotes Methodus of Athens with this statement. He says, "The gods have revealed wine to mortals to be the greatest blessing for those who use it aright, but for those who use it without measure, the reverse. For it gives food to them that take it and strengthens mind and body. In medicine, it is most beneficial. It can be mixed with liquid and drugs, and it brings aid to the wounded. In daily course, it is to those who mix and drink it moderately. It gives good cheer. If you overstep the bounds, it brings violence. Mix it half and half, and you get madness. Unmixed, bodily collapse." So those people, even if it was only diluted 1-to-1, it was still considered barbaric. It was still considered strong drink. So the lowest that I could find was 3-to-1. And like I said, all the way up to 20-to-1 and more. But the lowest I could find would be 3-to-1. Obviously, they used it in ancient times as medicine and, of course, as a beverage. But as a beverage, it was always diluted. It was always mixed. You would take that paste or that syrup base and mix it with water, and typically 3-to-1 or more. To drink it any other way was barbaric. Only barbarians would drink what was, and they called it strong drink if it wasn't diluted 3-to-1 or more. It was called strong drink. So going through church history, when you get out of the the New Testament church into the early church, the early church fathers wrote about this in a volume called the Apostolic Tradition. And in the Apostolic Tradition, it says that the early church followed the same custom, serving only mixed wine, whether from a syrup or a liquid base. So, because people said, well, what about the Lord's Supper? That had to be fermented wine. Well, no, it was not fermented wine. And I, at one time, attended a church that, previous to me being there, used to use fermented wine in the Lord's Supper. But when their pastor passed away and they had to find a new one, they knew they were never going to find a Baptist preacher who was going to come in and agree to use fermented wine in the Lord's Supper, so they gave that up, fortunately. But the argument of saying it was fermented wine, that does not hold water. That does not hold water. It was not fermented wine. Going all the way back to the early church, it was not fermented wine. So the significance is that, again, the wine that they drank in Bible times was either completely non-intoxicating or it was watered down to such a level that any alcohol in there was very, very minimal. Let me illustrate it to you. From the information I found, beer has an average of a 4% alcohol content. Wine has an average of 12% alcohol. Brandy, which is a fortified wine, has 15 to 20% alcohol, and hard liquors such as whiskey and scotch and rye and all that stuff has typically a 40% or 50% alcohol. In other words, you've heard the term proof before. If it's 80 proof, it's 40% alcohol. If it's 100 proof, it's 50% alcohol. Now, anybody who drank anything that was 15 to 50% alcohol in the Bible, definitely they would have been considered a barbarian. And I don't think we even have to spend time talking about the fact that that's not anything that a Christian would consider. It's roundly condemned in the Bible. And so let's use the conservative estimate on wine. And let's accept that wine ferments to a 12% alcohol content. And if we take the lowest mixture level that I could find, the 3-to-1, that's the lowest. If you took that 12% alcohol, fermented, and mixed it in a mixing bowl with 3 parts water to 1 part wine, that would bring the alcohol content down to 3% alcohol. That's really low. In fact, under our laws today, something is not even considered an alcoholic beverage unless the alcohol content is in excess of 3.2%. So it wouldn't have even been considered as alcohol. So, and that's at the lowest dilution of 3-to-1. It would have had less than a 3% alcohol content. And that again points to why the Bible warns the elders of the church and people, Christians, to not hang around the wine. In order to get drunk, you had a purpose to do so. You had to be able to override your bladder because you were going to have to drink a whole lot before it could affect you. If people wanted, if they were determined to get drunk, they would simply drink strong drink. There was no such thing as simply accidentally drinking too much and getting affected. All right, that was not a consideration. So the conclusion on this question, whether you're talking about the syrup, the paste, or whatever, it's always mixed. And the wine consumed in those days had a non-existent or negligible alcohol content. You couldn't get drunk unless you set out to do so. So people who say that wine was consumed in the Bible have to reconsider whether or not what they drank in the Bible is the same thing that people drink today. And the answer clearly, it is not. It is not. And we're already out of time. Only 7 more questions to go. We'll pick it up next time. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll be done for today. Our Heavenly